FBI because they believe in serving others. And the feedback I get from our state and local law enforcement partners, from our foreign partners, from the folks we work with in the private sector and the community, office after office after office has been very, very gratifying and reassuring to me. And I'm a big believer in the idea that the FBI speaks through its work, through its cases, through the victims it protects. And I encourage our folks not to get too hung up on what I consider to be the noise on TV and in social media.
So you haven't seen any evidence of some sort of inherent political bias in the agency?
No.
How do statements like that impact the morale of rank and file agents, or are they able to shake that off?
Well, we have 37,000 people. They're all individuals. They all think in their own way. But I guess I would say that our people are very mission-focused. They're accustomed to the fact that we do some of the hardest things there are to do for a living. And I like to think that our folks are pretty sturdy. I think of a woman I met just the other day, an agent in the Miami office who had a bad accident, 12 stitches in her face, and the next day, boom, right back at work. I think about the folks in the San Juan office that I visited recently. You want to talk about people going through a real storm.
Right.
They do it, and they're out in the community. And I can tell you the community values what they do on the island.
Thank you. An op-ed by a number of former intelligence analysts called the Nunes memo and its release, quote, one of the worst cases of politicization of intelligence in modern American history, end quote. You said you had concerns about that memo. I know you can't get into the gritty details of that, but can you say, in your view, whether or not one of those concerns is that it may have selectively cherry-picked information without presenting the entire fact pattern that led up to that FISA warrant application?
Well, Senator, I would just repeat what we said at the time, which is that we had then and continue to have now grave concerns about the accuracy of the memorandum because of omissions. We provided thousands of documents that were very sensitive and lots of briefings, and it's very hard for anybody to distill all that down to 3.5 pages.
Director Pompeo, have you seen Russian activity in the lead up to the 2018 election cycle?
Yes. So I paused only. I'm trying to make sure I stay on the unclassified side. Yes, we have seen Russian activity and intentions to have an impact on the next election cycle here.
Director Coates?
Yes, we have.
Anyone else? Admiral Rogers?
Yes, and I think this would be a good topic to get into greater detail this afternoon.
According to news reports, there are dozens of White House staff with only interim security clearances still, to include Jared Kushner until last week, to include White House Staff Secretary Rob Porter, who I would assume would have regularly reviewed classified documents as part of his job. Director Coates, if someone is flagged by the FBI with areas of concern in their background investigations into White House staff with interim clearances, should those staff continue to have access to classified materials?
Let me first just speak in general relative to temporary classifications. Clearly, with the new administration in particular, we're trying to fill a lot of new slots. And the classification process and security clearance process has been mentioned.
Yeah, I'm only speaking with regard to folks who may have had issues raised as opposed to just being in the matter, of course, of going through a long process.
Well, I'm not in a position, and we can talk about this in the classified session, but I'm not in a position to discuss what individual situations are for specified individuals. I might just say that. I think sometimes it is necessary to have some type of preliminary clearance in order to fill a slot. But I have publicly stated if that is the case, the access has to be limited in terms of the kind of information they can be in a position to receive or not receive. So I think that's something that we have to do as a part of our security clearance review. The process is broken. It needs to be reformed. It doesn't, as Senator Warner has previously said, it's not evolution, it's revolution. We have 700,000 backups. So we have situations where we need people in places, but they don't yet have that. Your specific question, I think I'd like to take up in the classified session.
Chairman, I'm over my time. Thank you, Director Coates.
Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Coates, Director Pompeo, Admiral Rogers, I think you all talked about evidence that the Russians would intend to do things to be active in our elections. There really seems to me two divisions of that activity. One is information that's put on the record that misleading, false, trying to develop that level. The other, even more sinister, might be the level of dealing with the election system itself, the voting day system, the registration system, and of those two, clearly the voting day system, the one we need to have the most concerns about, that critical infrastructure. You know, this committee has been working toward both of those goals of trying to shore up critical infrastructure on Election Day, as well as alert people to and decide what might be done about misinformation on the other side of the ledger. Voting begins in March. That's next month. If we're going to have any impact on securing that voting system itself, it would seem to me that we need to be acting quickly. I think a great part of the strength of the system is the diversity of the system, different not only from state to state, but from election jurisdictions within those states. That's a strength, not a weakness in my view. But what are some of the things we can do to be more helpful to local election officials in encouraging them to share information when they think their systems are being attacked, getting more information to them than we have? There was a lot of criticism in the last cycle that we knew that some election systems were being attacked and didn't tell them they were being attacked. And so the three of you, in any order, let's just do the order that I started with, Director Coates, Director Pompeo, Admiral Rogers, any thoughts you have on what we can do to protect the critical infrastructure of the election system and how quickly we need to act if we intend to do that this year?
Well, the intelligence community, all elements of it, are aware, and we want to provide, collect and provide as much information as we can so that we can give those warnings and alerts, so that we can share information back and forth with local and state and election processes with the federal government. Department of Homeland Security, Department of FBI, obviously are more involved given these are domestic issues, but we do look to every piece of intelligence we can gather so that we can provide these warnings. It is an effort that I think the government needs to put together at the state and local level and work with those individuals who are engaged in the election process in terms of the security of their machines. Cyber plays a major role here, and so I think it is clearly an area where the federal government, foreign collection on potential threats and of interference, warnings, and then processes in terms of how to put in place security and secure that to ensure the American people that their vote is sanctioned and well and not manipulated in any way whatsoever.
Director Pompeo.
Senator Blunt, when I answered Senator Heinrich's question earlier, I was referring to the former, the first part of your question, not truly to the latter. The things we've seen Russia doing to date are mostly focused on information types of warfare, the things that Senator Warner was speaking out most directly earlier. With respect to the CIA's role, and I think Admiral Rogers will say his too, we have two missions. One is to identify the source of this information, make those here domestically aware of it so that they can do the things they need to do, whether that's FBI or DHS, so that they have that information. We are working diligently along many threat vectors to do that. And then the second thing, and we can talk more about this afternoon, is we do have some capabilities offensively to raise the cost for those who would dare challenge the United States elections.
And after Admiral Rogers, Director Wray, I may want to come to you and see on that same sharing information, any impediments to sharing that information with local officials, or any reason we wouldn't want to do that. Admiral Rogers?
Senator, the only other thing I would add, and this is also shaped by my experience as Cyber Command, where I defend networks, is one of the things that we generally find in that role. Many network and system operators do not truly understand their own structures and systems. And so one of the things that I think is part of this is how do we help those local, federal, state entities truly understand their network structure, what its potential vulnerabilities, and to harness this information that the intelligence structure and other elements are providing them. It's not necessarily an intel function, but I think it's part of how do we work our way through this process.
Director Wray?
Senator, I think that's just one of the areas that there's been a lot of discussion about whether we're doing better, and this is one of the areas I think we are doing better. We together at the FBI, together with DHS, recently, for example, scheduled meetings with various state election officials, and normally the barrier there would be classification concerns, whether somebody had clearances. We were able to put together briefings appropriately tailored and with non-disclosure agreements with those officials. So there are ways, if people are a little bit creative and forward-leaning, to educate the state election officials, which is, of course, where elections are run in this country.
Well, hopefully we'll be creative and forward-leaning, and we'll want to keep track of what we're doing there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First statement I want to make is more in sorrow than in anger. I'll get to the anger part in a minute. The sorrow part is that, Director Coates, in response to a question from Senator Collins, you gave an eloquent, factual statement of the activities of the Russians and the fact that they're continuing around the world and that they're a continuing threat to this country. All of you have agreed to that. If only the President would say that. I understand the President's sensitivity about whether his campaign was in connection with the Russians, and that's a separate question, but there is no question. We've got before us the entire intelligence community that the Russians interfered in the election in 2016. They're continuing to do it, and they're a real imminent threat to our elections in a matter of 8 or 9 months. My problem is I talk to people in Maine who say the whole thing is a witch hunt and it's a hoax because the President told me. I just wish you all could persuade the President as a matter of national security to separate these two issues. The collusion issue is over here, unresolved. We'll get to the bottom of that. But there's no doubt, as you all have testified today, and we cannot confront this threat, which is a serious one, with a whole-of-government response when the leader of the government continues to deny that it exists. Now, let me get to the anger part. The anger part involves cyber attacks. You have all testified that we're subject to repeated cyber attacks. Cyber attacks are occurring right now in our infrastructure all over this country. I am sick and tired of going to these hearings, which I've been going to for 5 years, where everybody talks about cyber attacks, and our country still does not have a policy or a doctrine or a strategy for dealing with them. And this is not a criticism of the current administration. I'm an equal opportunity critic here. The prior administration didn't do it either. Admiral Rogers, until we have some deterrent capacity, we are going to continue to be attacked. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir. We have to change this current dynamic because we're on the wrong end of the cost equation here.
And we are trying to fight a global battle with our hands tied behind our back. Director Coates, you have a stunning statement in your report. They will work to use cyber operations to achieve strategic objectives unless they face clear repercussions for their cyber operations. Right now, there are none. Is that not the case? There are no repercussions. We have no doctrine of deterrence. How are we ever going to get them to stop doing this if all we do is patch our software and try to defend ourselves?
Those are very relevant questions, and I think everyone, not only at this table, but in every agency of government, understands the threat that we have here and the impact already being made through these cyber threats. Our role as the intelligence community is to provide all the information we possibly can as to what is happening so our policymakers can take that, including the Congress, and shape policy as to how we are going to respond to this and deal with this in a whole of government way.
It just never seems to happen. Director Pompeo, you understand this issue, do you not? We are not going to be able to defend ourselves from cyber attacks by simply being defensive. We have to have a doctrine of deterrence. If they strike us in cyber, they are going to be struck back in some way. It may not be cyber.
I would agree with you. I would also argue that, and while I can't say much in this setting, I would argue that your statement that we have done nothing does not reflect the responses that, frankly, some of us at this table have engaged in, and the United States government has engaged in both before and after this but both during and before this administration.
But deterrence doesn't work unless the other side knows it. The doomsday machine in Dr. Strangelove didn't work because the Russians hadn't told us about it.
It's true that it's important that the adversary know it. It is not a requirement that the whole world know it.
And the adversary does know it, in your view?
I'd prefer to save that for another forum.
Well, I believe that this country needs a clear doctrine. What is a cyber attack? What is an act of war? What will be the response? What will be the consequences? And right now, I haven't.
Senator, I agree.
5 years, I haven't seen it.
I agree with you. We collectively, it is a complicated problem given the nature of.
Include us, by the way.
Yes, I would too. And as I sat as a member of the House of Representatives for 6 years, I take responsibility for not having been part of solving that too. There is a lot of work here to do. We do need a U.S. government strategy and clear authorities to go achieve that strategy.
I appreciate it. I just don't want to go home to Maine when there's a serious cyber attack and say, well, we never really got to it. We knew it was a problem, but we had 4 different committees of jurisdiction and we just couldn't work it out.
Yes, sir.
That's not going to fly.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your service.
Senator, I might just add that we don't want to learn this lesson the hard way. 9/11 took place because we were not coordinating our efforts. We are now coordinating our efforts. But we didn't have the right defenses in place because the right information was not there. Our job is to get that right information to the policymakers and get on with it because it's just common sense. If someone is attacking you and there's no retribution or response, it's just going to incentivize more contacts.
Right.
Right now, there are a lot of blank checks. There's a lot of things that we need to do.
Director Coates, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Langford.
Thank you. Director Coates, you and I talked last year about this same issue that Senator King was just bringing up as well about cyber doctrine and a point person on who that would be and a defined person that would give options to the President and to Congress to say if a response is needed and is warranted. This is the person, this is the entity that would make those recommendations and allow the President to be able to make decisions on what the proper response is. Has that been completed? Is there a point person to be able to give recommendations on an appropriate response to a cyber attack to the President?
That has not yet been completed. Of course, your understanding of the stand-up of Cyber Command and the new director that will be replacing Admiral Rogers, the decision relative to whether there would be a separation between the functions that are currently now NSA and cyber is yet to be made. General Mattis is contemplating what the next best step is, and they've involved the intelligence community in terms of making decisions in that role. But we, at this particular point, cannot point to one sort of cyber czar, but various agencies throughout the federal government are taking this very, very seriously, and there are individuals that we continue to meet on a regular basis. The OD&I has something called CTIC, and that is a coordination effort for all the cyber that comes in so that we don't stovepipe like what we did before 9/11. So things are underway, but in terms of putting a finalized this is how we're going to do it together is still in process.
Senator Langford, with respect to responses to that, these are Title X DOD activities unless they're granted to some other authority, a Title 50 authority. So there is a person responsible. Secretary Mattis has that responsibility to advise the President on the appropriateness of responses in all theaters of conflict with our adversaries.
Okay, thank you. I want to bring up the issue of the rising threat of what's happening just south of our border in Mexico. In Mexico, homicide rate went up 27% last year. We had 64,000 Americans that died from overdose of drugs. The preponderance of those came through or from Mexico. We have a very rapidly rising threat, it appears to me. And what I'd be interested from y'all is on a national security level and what you're seeing. What are we facing? What's changing right now in Mexico versus 10 years ago Mexico and our relationship and the threats that are coming from there?
I would defer to Director Wray relative to what his agency is doing. I mean, clearly we have a continuing problem, and the Mexican government has a continuing problem relative to the gangs and the organizations. There have been some high-profile arrests lately. We've taken down some labs. Mexico is cooperating, but and they themselves will admit that it's almost overwhelming. For their army's been participating. It's almost overwhelming for them to control the situation south of the border. We have our own issues then on border protection and as well as consumption here in the United States.
Director Wray.
In many ways, what we're seeing is just more of the same, but one of the things that's changed, because I think that was at the heart of your question, I think we're seeing, one of the things we're watching in particular is more black market fentanyl being shipped to transnational criminal organizations in Mexico, and then, you know, they're taking advantage of the pricing advantages, and that's being then delivered in large quantities to our streets. Certainly, the Mexico relationship is, from a law enforcement perspective and from a domestic security perspective, one of our most important. I think the FBI LEGAT office in Mexico is our largest in the world. I'm pretty sure about that, or pretty close to it, if not. And that's a reflection of how much activity there is.
Let me ask you a specific Oklahoma question that's also a national question. There was an individual named Al-Falaj that was picked up in Weatherford, Oklahoma, just a couple of weeks ago by the FBI. His fingerprints were identified from a terror training camp in Afghanistan. He'd been in the country for multiple years. And what I'm trying to be able to determine is the coordination of information to local law enforcement and from data that's gathered from some of the work that's happening overseas in Afghanistan and such. How are those two being married together that we can identify individuals that are a threat to our nation based on their participation in a terror training camp overseas now coming to the American shores?
Well, certainly we've become better at looking at biometric information from overseas and marrying it up with potential threat subjects here in the U.S. as well as in some of our allies. The individual in question, of course, turned out to have his fingerprints on information from the Al-Farouk camp. And it's just a reminder to us that, you know, an awful lot of people went through those camps. And while the civilized world, the intelligence community, law enforcement, military, our allies around the world made a major dent on those people, we're kidding ourselves if we think that an awful lot of them aren't still out there. And it's just a reminder that we need to stay on the balls of our feet.
Right.
Senator Langer, if I could, just one additional point. You asked what has changed in Mexico. What has also transpired over the last couple of years is you had 5 principal cartels. We alluded to a number of captures that have taken place, over 100. Those 5 cartels have kind of devolved into 20, and part of that outgrowth, you've seen an increase in the level of violence.
Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you. First, let me just say on behalf of the people of West Virginia, I want to thank you for the job you do in keeping us safe. The professionalism, and we have all the utmost confidence in what you're doing and hope to be able to support even further. But thank you. The people really do appreciate it, and we appreciate the service you're giving. Director Coates, I think you and I both were in the Senate at the same time when Mike Mullen, then Admiral Mullen, said that the greatest threat we face. I was just on armed services. You were on intelligence at that time, and we were trying to find out what the greatest threat the United States faces. And I was thinking of another country, whether it be Russia, China, or whatever. And he didn't hesitate when he said that the threat of our nation, the greatest threat, is the death of our nation. And I think you just reiterated that in your opening remarks. Director, I was a little bit missed about the report, the Worldwide Threat Assessment. You didn't mention the debt in here. It wasn't in the report as a threat to the nation. And I didn't know if there was a thought process behind that, because you made a tremendous effort to put that in your opening statement. I appreciate that, but tell me what your thought process here was.
Well, my thought process was that I'm getting a little bit out of my lane in terms of what I'm supposed to do, but I felt that
I mean, you do think it's a threat. It's not in this assessment.
it's a threat that, it's something that Congress needs to deal with, and I didn't want to come back and preach at you.
I got you.
But I thought at the very end, in fact, just yesterday, look, I think I have a responsibility to raise this issue because it does affect the military significantly. It affects the intelligence community, which is tied to the military in terms of intelligence. It's going to have a serious effect on us.
Well, you said on both sides of the aisle. The only thing that seems to be bipartisan here today is spending money. Both sides seem to agree on spending more money without any accountability. So I'm glad to hear your remarks on that. If I could, to all the witnesses, I share what Senator Langford has said about concerns about what's killing more Americans than any of the threats discussed that we have today, and it's with drugs. My state of West Virginia has been hit harder than any state. I got more deaths per capita than any state. It's been ravaging as far as my communities, my homes, my schools, the families. It's just unbelievable what we're going through. I think in a nutshell what I would be asking, all of you all are responsible to do everything you can to keep us safe, and you've done a tremendous job as far as from a foreign attack and things of that sort. And Director Wray, I appreciate what the FBI does, and they have a strong presence in West Virginia, and we're very, very appreciative of that. What type of efforts from each one of your agencies have you spent as far as is drugs and fighting the drug infestation highest on your priority list, one of your greatest dangers, or is it just part of the overall scheme of things? And
well, just speaking for the intelligence, just speaking for the intelligence community, it is a high priority for us. We mentioned it in our threat assessment here, and so we are the collectors of foreign sources at transnational organizations, et cetera. What it's coming from overseas, whether it's coming from Afghanistan, whether it's coming from Colombia, what it is, how it's going, and then of course, it is a whole of government because once it penetrates the United States, we then use our domestic agencies to
Director Wray, as far as in the FBI, because you're on the front line, you're here on the homeland, and what do you think? What can we do to help?
Well, I think on the good news side, in a country that's often very divided, this is one issue, as far as I can tell, where everybody agrees about what a major threat it is. It covers communities from north to south, from red to blue, from rich to poor, from urban to rural. And I think it has, that's the good news. The bad news is it's grown to a point where there's no one agency or one approach that's going to solve the problem. So we're doing our part. Some of the things that we're able to do, we're focusing particularly on gatekeepers, because a lot of this is coming through medical professionals and pharmacies. And so we're using intelligence-driven operations there, various initiatives. We have a prescription drug initiative that's focused on that part of it. We're partnering with our foreign counterparts. We're working with DEA, state and local law enforcement, et cetera. We're also trying to do things to raise awareness. We did a video with DEA called Chasing the Dragon, which is, kind of been shown in schools around the country. But this is a multidisciplinary problem.
My time is short. Yeah. If I could just ask this question, maybe whoever wants to answer this one. Based on what we know and the way we distribute money to for foreign aid to different countries, knowing that a lot of the countries we distribute aid to is basically permitting this type of scourge coming to our country as far as in the form of drugs. Have you all thought and considered and make recommendations that we hold them hostage, if you will, or liable basically to the money they're receiving from the United States for the best of intentions? But that best of intentions is their fight against drugs coming to our country when we know it's coming from whether it be China, Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever it may be coming from, Mexico, and all the South American countries. We should hold that. I mean, I've never seen it. We're going to lose a whole generation. In West Virginia, I have 10,000 jobs I can't fill. The United States has 3 million jobs we can't fill, and most of it is around drugs. So this is what we're asking for. This has got to be all hands on deck. I don't know if anybody wants to. Do you all have that as a high priority? Does anyone believe we should withhold foreign aid to countries that basically we know have illicit drugs coming to our country?
Senator, I'll answer this. I think the United States should use every tool, whether that's foreign aid or other tools.
It seems like money talks.
To get these, and that's exactly right, to get these nations that this is coming from to put it as a priority for their country too. Some don't have the capacity to fix it. That is, it's a problem that's bigger than their nation. But we should be unafraid to use the leverage that comes with our generosity from the American taxpayer to ensure that these countries are doing everything they can to prevent drugs from coming from their country to ours.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
As you do know, we do provide efforts within countries to help them eradicate. It hasn't been totally successful, but that is one way in which we use some of that aid if it's directly contributed to the eradication of drugs.
Thank you all.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your appearance, and thanks to all the men and women who you represent and the work they do for our country. Mr. Wray, are you aware of a gentleman by the name of Oleg Deripaska?
I've heard the name.
Is it fair to call him a Putin-linked Russian oligarch?
Well, I'll leave that characterization to others, and certainly not in this setting.
Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, last week sent a letter to a London-based lawyer who represents Mr. Deripaska and asked if Christopher Steele was employed either directly or indirectly by Oleg Deripaska at the time he was writing the so-called Steele dossier. Do you know if Christopher Steele worked for Oleg Deripaska?
That's not something I can answer.
Could we discuss it in a classified setting?
There might be more we could say there.
Thank you. And maybe we'll hear back from the lawyer in London as well to give us a straight answer. Jim Comey testified before this committee in an open setting last summer, and he referred to the Steele dossier as salacious and unverified. Does that remain the FBI's position?
I think maybe there's more we can talk about this afternoon on that.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to turn my attention to the threat posed by China and specifically Chinese telecom companies. Senator Rubio spoke earlier, and I agree with what he said about the threat of a rising China and also the threat of Confucius centers. There's also the threat that telecom companies, specifically Huawei and ZTE, but also Unicom and Telecom, pose to our country. That's why I've introduced legislation with Senator Cornyn and Senator Rubio to say the U.S. government can't use Huawei or ZTE, and that the U.S. government can't use companies that use them. And I'm glad that some companies like Verizon, AT&T, among others, have taken this threat seriously. Could you explain what the risk is that we face from ZTE and Huawei being used in the United States, especially here in this public setting, the risk that companies, state governments, local governments might face if they use Huawei or ZTE products and services?
I think probably the simplest way to put it in this setting would be that we're deeply concerned about the risks of allowing any company or entity that is beholden to foreign governments that don't share our values to gain positions of power inside our telecommunications networks. That provides the capacity to exert pressure or control over our telecommunications infrastructure. It provides the capacity to maliciously modify or steal information, and it provides the capacity to conduct undetected espionage. So at a 100,000-foot level, at least in this setting, those are the kinds of things that worry us. I will say, like you, Senator, we've been gratified, I think, to date by the response of the large U.S. telecommunications providers to our trying to raise awareness on this issue. But I also recognize that the competitive pressures are building, and so it's something that I think we have to be very vigilant about and continue, as you all are doing, to raise awareness about.
Admiral Rogers, would you care to add anything about the threat posed by Huawei?
I would agree with Director Wray's characterization here, and this is a challenge, I think, that's only going to increase, not lessen over time for us.
So you would suggest to mayors, county judges, university presidents, state legislatures to look warily if Huawei or ZTE comes bearing gifts to them?
I would say you need to look long and hard at companies like this.
All the witnesses, I'd like to address this question to you. Will you please raise your hand if you would use products or services from Huawei or ZTE? None of you would. You obviously lead intelligence services, so that's something of a biased question. Raise your hand if you would recommend that private American citizens use Huawei or ZTE products or services. None of you, again, are raising your hand. Thank you for that. Finally, I'd like to turn to a question, Director Pompeo, that's been in the news in the last few hours. There are reports that over 200 Russian mercenaries were killed in eastern Syria. Can you confirm or deny those reports?
Senator Cotton, I'll leave to the Department of Defense to talk about what transpired there. I can say this, from an intelligence perspective, we have seen in multiple instances foreign forces using mercenaries in battles that will begin to approach the United States.
General Ashley, since you represent the Department of Defense, would you like to confirm or deny?
Yeah, if we could take that to a closed session, Senator, I think we can lay out a rather interesting fabric of what is Syria and what transpired over the last week.
We can address that in the afternoon. Director Pompeo, to come back as a general matter, can I ask, is massing and maneuvering forces against a location where U.S. personnel are present in Syria a good way to get yourself killed?
I think I'll defer that to the Department of Defense as well.
General Ashley, would you like to answer that question?
So that does make you more susceptible. I would leave that also to the operational commander, but you are at greater risk when you start to mass in that situation.
Not a good idea if you want to have a long and fruitful life. Thank you.
Senator Harris.
Thank you. I want to echo the comments of my colleagues in thanking the men and women who serve in your agencies. I am concerned that the political attacks against the men and women of your agencies may have had an effect on your ability to recruit, retain, and also the morale of your agencies. So I would like to emphasize the point that we all, I think, share in making, which is we thank the men and women of your agencies for their selfless work. They do it on behalf of the American people without any expectation of award or reward, and we cannot thank them enough for keeping us safe. Director Wray, Chairman Nunes's memo included sensitive FISA information regarding a person who worked on the president's campaign. According to the White House statement, the president was the one who authorized the memo's declassification. Do you believe there is an actual, or at least the appearance of a conflict of interest when the president is put in charge of declassifying information that could complicate an ongoing investigation into his own campaign?
Well, Senator, as we've been very clear what our view was about the disclosure and accuracy of the memo in question, but I do think it's the president's role as commander-in-chief under the rule that was invoked to object or not to the declassification. So I think that, that is the president's responsibility.
Regardless of whether there is an appearance or actual conflict of interest?
Well, I leave it to others to characterize whether there's appearance or actual conflict of interest, but I think the president was fulfilling his responsibility in that situation.
If the president asked you tomorrow to hand over to him additional sensitive FBI information on the investigations into his campaign, would you give it to him?
I'm not going to discuss the investigation in question with the president, or much less provide information from that investigation to him.
And if he received that information and then wanted to declassify it, would he have the ability to do that from your perspective?
Information from the...
However he received it, perhaps from members of the United States Congress.
I think illegally he would have that ability.
And do you believe the president should recuse himself from reviewing and declassifying sensitive FBI material related to this investigation?
I think recusal questions are something I would encourage the president to talk to the White House counsel about.
And has the FBI done any kind of legal analysis on these questions?
Well, happily, I'm no longer in the business of doing legal analysis. I now get to be a client and blame lawyers for things instead of being the lawyer who gets blamed. So we have not done legal analysis.
Have you blamed any lawyers for their analysis of this issue?
What's that?
Have you blamed any lawyers for their analysis of this?
I have not yet, no.
Okay. Is the FBI getting the cooperation it needs from social media companies to counter foreign adversaries' influence on our elections?
I think the cooperation has been improving. I think we're continuing to work with the social media companies to try to see how we can raise their awareness so that they can share information with us and vice versa. So I think things are moving in the right direction, but I think there's a lot of progress to be made.
What more do you need from social media companies to improve the partnership that you'd like to have with them to counter these attacks?
Well, I mean, I think we always like to have more information shared more quickly from their end, but I think from their perspective, it's a dialogue. They're looking to get information from us about what it is we see so that they can give responsive information. So I think we're working through those issues.
Do you believe that the social media companies have enough employees that have the appropriate security clearance to make these partnerships real?
That's not an issue I've evaluated, but I'd happy to take a look at it.
Please do and follow up with the committee. Director Coates, one of the things that makes guarding against foreign intelligence threats on social media so complex is that the threat originates overseas, and so that would be within the jurisdiction of the CIA and the NSA. And then it comes to our shores, and then it passes on to the FBI and also the social media companies themselves. I'm not aware of any written IC strategy on how we would confront the threat to social media. Does such a strategy exist in writing?
I would have to get back with you on that. I'd be happy to look into it. From my perspective right now, a written strategy, specific strategy is not in place, but I want to check on that.
Okay, please do follow up. And also, last year, Congress passed a bipartisan Russia sanctions bill. However, the administration has not imposed those sanctions. From an intelligence perspective, what is your assessment of how Russia interprets the administration's inaction?
I don't have information relative to what the Russian thinking is in terms of that particular specific reaction. There are other sanctions, as you know, that are being imposed on Russian oligarchs and others through the United Nations and through other things that have been done in reference to the JCPOA. But specifically on your question, I don't have an answer for that.
Senator
Can you
Harris,
provide? Yes.
may I just comment? I think we ought to look at that in a broader context. That is how the Russians view all of the actions of this administration, not just a particular set of sanctions or the absence thereof. So as we've watched the Russians respond to this administration's decision to provide defensive weapons in Ukraine, to push back against Russian efforts in Syria, sanctions placed on Venezuela were directly in conflict with Russian interests. The list of places that the Russians are feeling the pain from this administration's actions are long.
But, Director Pompeo, I'm sure you would agree that in order to understand the full scope of effect, it is also important that we analyze each discrete component, including what is the interpretation of this administration's failure to enact the sanctions, as has been passed and directed by the United States Congress in a bipartisan manner. Have you done that assessment?
So, Senator, in closed session, I'll tell you what we know and don't know about that discrete issue.
Right.
And I'm happy to, yes, I agree with you. It is important to look at each one in its own place. But I think what we most often see in terms of Russian response, it's to the cumulative activities in response to Russian activities. That is how the United States responds to those in a cumulative way.
Thank you. I look forward to our conversation.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
Warner.
Director Coates, you alluded to the activities of transnational criminal organizations, and I'm thinking particularly as regards our neighbors down south of our border. Recently, I heard somebody refer to the cartels, these transnational criminal organizations, as commodity agnostic. In other words, they'll traffic in people, they'll traffic in drugs and other contraband, all in pursuit of money.
Whatever brings in the most dollars.
Senator Manchin, I know, and others have alluded to their concern about, and certainly we all share the concern about the deaths and overdoses caused by drugs in America, much of which comes across our southern borders through our ports of entry. This week we're going to be considering border security measures as part of a larger package that the President has proposed while addressing the so-called DACA recipients. But do you believe that
modernizing our ports of entry, providing an enhanced technology and other means to surveil and follow and identify illegal drugs coming across our ports of entry would be a good thing for us to do?
I do think that a layered approach is necessary to, it's clear that just one specific defense put in place is not going to solve the problem. It needs to be a layered